Welcome to Folk Fear, where forgotten rituals breathe again, and tradition is never truly dead. Tonight, we weave a tale, but not with silk, not with cotton. We weave with hair, human hair, and every strand carries a memory, a death, a curse. In a remote village lost to time, widows are forbidden to love again, not by men, not by law, but by a thread. A thread made from the mourning hair of every woman before them. A thread that whispers when the loom stops. A thread that binds the living to the dead. This is the story of Mira, a woman who tried to burn her grief away and awaken something that never truly left. So sit back, don't blink, and whatever you do, keep weaving. They came in silence, wrapped in gray shawls, barefoot on soil still damp from last night's storm. The women of the village moved like smoke. One by one, they entered Mira's house. No one cried, no one spoke her name, but they all came to watch her become one of them. She stood beside the body, her husband's skin already turning, his mouth slightly open, as if trying to speak one last warning. Mira didn't weep, not because she didn't love him, but because the grief had hardened into something colder, something dense, something she couldn't yet name. At noon, when the sun touched the top of the shrine post, the procession began. Mira was handed a small bundle wrapped in deep maroon cloth. It was light, but pulsed strangely in her hands, like it was breathing. The eldest widow stepped forward, her voice a soft rasp, each word shaped by the wind. You must weave it. You must not stop. And you must never destroy it, or he will return, but not as the man you buried. Mira unwrapped the cloth and saw it. Black, shimmering, tightly wound into a spool, a thread not of cotton, but of hair. Some coarse, some fine, some red, some gray, some still scented faintly of smoke or rose oil. She felt bile rise in her throat, but said nothing, because this was the way, and no woman had ever refused it, not aloud. That night, the loom was brought to her window. The first strand fed through the shuttle, her fingers clumsy, her breath shallow. Outside, the sky was pale and open, the forest line unmoving. Inside, the first sound of grief began to hum, soft, mechanical, endless. Weft, pull, tighten, repeat. Weft, pull, tighten, repeat. She worked until her fingers ached, until her eyes blurred, and when she finally looked away, just for a moment to rest, she thought she saw him, not lying still, but sitting up, staring, his mouth full of thread and stitched closed. The loom sat by the window, tall, silent, waiting. It had been unused for years. Dust clung to its wooden frame like old skin, and when Mira touched it, the surface felt warm, as if someone had just left it. The spool of hair thread lay beside her, still wrapped in maroon cloth, still pulsing, still wrong. She sat, took a deep breath, and reached for the first strand. It resisted, not by force, not by tension, but by memory. because when she pulled, she swore she heard it whimper. Not from her hand, but from behind her ear, a soft sound, a woman's voice, a whisper that did not belong to her. She froze, turned. Nothing. Outside, the forest was still. Even the wind refused to move. She fed the thread through the shuttle, her hands trembling. The hair was slick, smooth, like it had just been combed. She began to weave, weft, pull, tighten, breathe. With each motion, she felt less herself, as if each strand she laid down took something from her. A memory, a smile, a breath that used to come easier. Her mother had once taught her to weave with silk, delicate, precise, alive. But this wasn't silk. This was mourning given form. This was death refusing to rot. As the pattern grew, her head began to ache, not sharp, but dull, persistent, like something pressing against her skull from the inside. She stopped to wipe her forehead and noticed it in the mirror across the room. Her reflection wasn't weaving. It was staring at her, head tilted, lips stitched shut with tread, hair falling like ink across the face, and it was smiling. Mira turned. The chair was empty, the room unchanged, but when she looked back at the cloth, she saw a knot she didn't make, woven in the center, tight, fresh, and it was in the shape of a mouth. That night, she didn't sleep, not because she was afraid, but because the loom didn't stop weaving. Even when she left the room, even when she covered it with cloth, even when she begged aloud for it to stop, it kept weaving by itself. And outside her door, the wind carried the soft sound of thread being pulled through bone. The mirror was old, oval-shaped, framed in blackwood that smelled faintly of pine and ash. It had once belonged to her husband, a wedding gift passed down through 3 generations of widowers, never removed from the bedroom, never cleaned. Mira had never liked it. It didn't reflect light, only shadows. But now it stared at her like a second face, one she couldn't turn away from. She tried covering it with a shawl. The thread women said it was allowed. Only at night, they warned, or it will forget who you are. That phrase lingered. Forget who you are. As if the mirror held a memory of her, as if it watched long enough to become her. That night, after hours at the loom, Mira stepped into her bedroom, her shoulders stiff, her back aching, her fingers raw. The room was quiet, but the air was wrong. She reached for the shawl to drape over the mirror, but paused. Her reflection was already there, already staring, already moving, but she wasn't. In the glass, she stood taller, her hair longer, wet, slick against her cheeks. Her hands weren't empty, they held scissors, old, iron, heavy. She blinked. The reflection smiled, a thin, pulled smile, like thread stitched from one ear to the other. Then it lifted the scissors and brought them to her own throat. Mira gasped, stepped back. The shawl fell from her hands. When she looked again, the mirror was empty. Just the room, just her, breathing too fast. She backed away, closed the bedroom door, and pushed the dresser against it. But later, much later, when the moon was high and the forest hissed with fog, she heard it. Snip. Soft, precise, like shears cutting through hair. Snip. Again. From behind the door, from behind the mirror, from behind her own thoughts. And when she awoke, her pillow was covered in strands, long, black, not hers, and her mouth tasted of ash.
No one ever said it, but everyone knew. There were rules in this village, old ones, threaded into lullabies, into meals, into the way women walked with their heads bowed, as if gravity pulled harder on grief. Mira began to notice the silence, not just around her, but inside her. The women didn't ask how she slept. They didn't ask about the mirror, or the threads, or the hair. They only asked, "Are you still weaving?" And Mira always said yes, even when her hands bled, even when the cloth began to move on its own, even when she knew she wasn't the only one weaving. One day, she followed the oldest widow, the one with no teeth, no name, only a cane carved from animal bone. The old woman walked into the northern part of the village, where no lanterns hung, where the houses had no windows. She entered a small hut, sunken into the ground. Its roof was covered in vines, its door tied shut with red string. Mira waited, watched, her breath fogging in the cold air despite the summer heat. Then she heard it. Voices, dozens, maybe more, whispering all at once, but not in words, in threads. The sound of fiber stretching, tightening, pulling across wood, pulling through skin. And laughter, not cruel, not joyful, just inevitable. She stumbled backward, and a hand caught her. It was the midwife, her eyes dull, her mouth stitched at the corner, not with thread, but with silence. "You shouldn't be here," she whispered, her voice broken from disuse. Mira asked the question that had lived in her throat for weeks. Who made these rules? The midwife looked away, then down, to the ground beneath their feet, the soil dark and wet. "They did it," she said. "Who?" The midwife's eyes glistened. "The ones buried with open mouths." That night, Mira tried to sleep, but each time she closed her eyes, she dreamed of the earth below her house, filled with whispering skulls, hair still growing, reaching, tugging at the wooden beams of her floor. And in the dream, she wasn't Mira. She was someone older, someone watching from the shadows, and her hands weren't weaving. They were pulling the thread tighter around someone else's throat. Mira waited until the village slept, until every loom had quieted, until even the crickets forgot to sing. She wrapped the spool in a cloth soaked with lamp oil, hands shaking, breath shallow. She didn't care if it screamed, she didn't care if it bled, she just wanted it gone. She walked deep into the forest, where the trees leaned like mourners, where the path curved as if afraid to go straight. And there, in a clearing used for old burnings, she lit the fire. The flames caught fast, greedy, yellow teeth devouring black thread, crackling like dry bone. Mira stood back, eyes wide, waiting to feel free. But instead, she heard it, breathing, not hers.
It came from the fire, low, rough, wet. Then a shape, not smoke, not shadow. A man stepped forward from the center of the flames, but not walking, sliding, like something pulled from a womb that wasn't meant to open. His mouth was sewn shut, just like in the mirror. His eyes burned, not with pain, but recognition. It was him, her husband, but twisted. Charred skin clinging to bone, ash falling from his shoulders, threaded hair still wrapped around his neck like a collar. He reached toward her, not fast, not aggressive, just inevitable. Mira ran. Branches scraped her face, roots pulled at her ankles, but she didn't stop. When she finally reached her home, she slammed the door shut, collapsed to the floor, and screamed. But no sound came out. Only hair. A single strand, long, black, slipped from her throat like a spider silk pulled from deep inside her. And behind her, the loom was weaving again, louder, faster, as if making up for lost time. When she dared to look, the spool was back, not burned, not even warm, wrapped in maroon, still pulsing. And from the window, far into the trees, she saw it. A pair of eyes, still burning, still watching.
Mira didn't sleep. Not truly. Not the way humans do. She drifted in and out, suspended in a half-dream where the air hummed and the looms spoke in the voice of the dead. When she woke, the first thing she felt wasn't the cold or the weight of her own breath. It was a tickle in her throat. Not pain, not illness, but movement, soft, thread-like. She sat up, coughed once, then again. Her mouth filled with something dry, something fibrous. She reached in with shaking fingers and pulled out a strand of hair, long, black, still warm. It kept coming. Another, then another, until she gagged. She stumbled from the bed, fell to her knees, vomited dry smoke and strands upon the floor. Ash clung to her lips, her gums bled. She looked at her hands, her fingernails, and saw hair growing beneath them, pushing up from under the nail beds like roots seeking light. She screamed, but no one came, because no one ever came for widows. They were meant to suffer quietly, to decay beautifully. She ran to the mirror, her mouth smeared black, her eyes bloodshot. But her reflection smiled, calm, patient. And when she blinked, it raised its hand, even though she didn't. It held a comb, made of bone. Then it began to brush her hair in the reflection, not her real hair, but the version in the mirror, longer, thicker, crawling like snakes across her shoulders. Behind her, the bed creaked. She turned. The pillow had shifted as if someone had lain on it during the night. She pulled it back, and there, where her head had rested, was a perfect circle of ash, and at the center, a single stitch sewn directly into the mattress, threaded with black hair. She reached to touch it, and it twitched. She pulled her hand back, stumbled away, heart pounding. And from the other room, the loom began again, not with her hands, but with someone else's, someone unseen, someone who never truly left. His name was Eli. He came with the dye merchants once every season, bringing bundles of crushed indigo and the smell of cities beyond the trees. Mira noticed him, not because he was handsome, but because he looked at her as if she was still alive. Most men in the village looked through her now, as if widowhood had made her heir, as if the black thread had already wrapped around her spirit. But Eli, he lingered, asked for water, laughed when she poured too much. He didn't know about the thread, about the loom, about the way her reflection sometimes blinked after she did. She didn't tell him. She let herself have this, just for a moment. He came again the next week, brought her dried figs and a scarf dyed violet. Too bright for mourning, he joked. She smiled, and for a second, it felt real. That night, she didn't weave. She sat by the river with Eli, listened to him hum old songs from a world she forgot existed. And when he touched her hand, she didn't pull away. When he kissed her, the forest didn't whisper, the sky didn't crack, only the thread did. She felt it snap somewhere deep inside, not loud, but enough to wake him. She returned home near dawn. The house was cold, but not empty. The loom had moved. It now stood by her bed, its shuttle still rocking, though no hands touched it. The cloth had grown, twice as long as before, its end dripping onto the floor, soaked with something wet. She stepped closer, footsteps behind her. She turned. No one. But the mirror had changed. In it, she was no longer alone. A figure stood behind her, close, head tilted, eyes like coal doused in water, lips sewn shut, smile wide, fingernails made of thread. She screamed, ran from the room. Eli's house was just across the field. She pounded on the door, called his name. No answer. She found the door unlocked, the bed unmade, the fire cold. But on the pillow laid a single strand of black hair, long, looped into a knot. And under the bed, nothing. Not shoes, not a bag, not a man. Just a folded violet scarf, torn in half. And on the wall, drawn in ash, a single word. Mine. Mira didn't return to the loom. She closed the door, bolted it, pushed a table in front, and swore she would never weave again. She buried the violet scarf, laid stones over the soil, lit incense, and whispered Eli's name like a prayer that might bring him back, like a curse that might keep him away. But the house did not forgive her. That night, the sound returned. Soft at first, like rain on wood, then louder, scraping, dragging. She lit a candle, walked slowly down the hall. The loom was still locked behind the door, but the sound was coming from the floor, from her bedroom. She stepped inside and stopped. The cloth, the grief mantle, had unspooled itself. It now stretched across the room, across the walls, up the ceiling, spilling from the window, crawling down the steps like a dark tide. It pulsed. She saw it with her own eyes, the way it expanded and contracted as if breathing. Its fibers writhed, looping into knots, undoing and reweaving themselves faster than any human hand could move. It was finishing itself. She stepped closer. Her candle flickered, then dimmed, and in the half-light she saw them, faces pressed into the cloth, beneath the weave, eyes closed, mouths slightly parted, some familiar, some not, but all dead. And near the bottom, near where the shroud first began, was Eli. His lips still formed her name,
his eyes still open, frozen in mid-blink, as if he'd been taken while turning to look back. She screamed, reached for him, tore at the threads, but the cloth screamed back, a sound like 1,000 nails dragged across wood, a voice with no mouth, no mercy. The edges of the shroud snapped up like limbs and wrapped around her wrists. She fought, kicked, tore free, fled the room, slammed the door. The cloth did not follow, but it watched. It pressed its length against the door, a dark shape, breathing. She ran to the shrine at the village center, fell to her knees before the fire pit. The elders found her at dawn, hair tangled, eyes wide, hands trembling. "I didn't mean to love," she whispered. "I only wanted to feel warm again." They said nothing, only helped her up. And as they walked her back, she looked over her shoulder. The shrine's central pole, the one where mourning banners were once hung, now bore a single, fresh thread, looped in the shape of a noose, still wet, still moving. They took her to the oldest house in the village, the widow's hall, built of dark timber, lined with faded portraits, nuns smiling. No one lived there now, only memories did. The elders didn't speak. They simply gestured to a seat in the center of the room, a circle of salt drawn at its feet. Mira sat. An old woman emerged from the back, small, bent, skin the color of old parchment. She carried nothing, but her presence pressed like a weight on Mira's chest. Her voice, when it came, was smoke. "You touched the thread without permission." Mira opened her mouth to speak, but the old woman raised her finger. "Not the loom, the thread, the hair, the truth." She knelt beside Mira, reached into the folds of her robe, and pulled out a bundle wrapped in crimson silk. She unwrapped it slowly. Inside, a single braid, thick, coiled, still glistening. "This," the old woman said, "belonged to my sister. She died young, pregnant, betrayed. She was the first." Mira stared at the braid. Something inside her recoiled, but the old woman's eyes never blinked. "They buried her without her hair, said it was secret, said it had to be kept for mourning. They thought it honored her. They were wrong. She screamed for nights after they put her in the ground." Mira's voice cracked. "You heard her?" The old woman nodded. "And so we began to weave, not to grieve, but to keep them still, to bind them. Every hair is a chain, every stitch is a lock." Mira's breath trembled. "Then what am I doing?" The old woman smiled, but it wasn't kind. "You're the jailer, and the thread is hungry." She pointed to Mira's arms, to the skin just above her wrists. Tiny black strands had begun to push through, barely visible, but there. Mira gasped, tried to rub them away. "They want out," she whispered. "They want more. You gave love to another. You broke the vow. You gave them a soul to claim." Mira's voice was no more than a breath. "Eli." The woman wrapped the braid back in silk, tied it with red string, and handed it to Mira. "If you wish to end this, burn it at the place she died. But you must go alone, and you must take your grief with you. Mira stood, braid in hand, salt on her boots, the weight of the past hanging from her shoulder like a noose. Outside, the sky had gone dark, though the sun had not yet set. And in the trees, the wind whispered in strands, not words, but names, too many to count, all made of hair.
The braid felt heavier with every step, as if it knew where she was taking it, as if it remembered how it had died. Mira walked alone, no lantern, no prayer, only the red bundle pressed to her chest and the forest closing in like a mouth. She returned to the clearing, where she had once tried to burn the thread, where he had first appeared in the flames. The air was colder here, still, as if even wind didn't dare speak. She lit the fire. This time, the flame hesitated, flickered, questioned her, as if asking, "Are you sure?" Mira didn't answer. She placed the braid into the center, pushed it deep into the embers, and waited. Smoke rose, gray, then black, then white. Thick and heavy, like breath held too long. Then the scream came. It didn't come from the fire. It came from the trees, from the roots, from under her skin. A sound of grief so sharp, so old, it broke the silence open. Mira fell to her knees, covered her ears, but the sound slipped in anyway, through her pores, through her blood. The fire roared, the braid writhed. It did not burn. It unraveled, strand by strand, spinning itself upward, wrapping into the air, forming a shape. A woman, pregnant, mouth open in a silent howl, hair falling like waterfalls of shadow. Her eyes met Mira's, and they begged, not for life, but for release. Mira knew then this wasn't about fire, not really. It was about blood, about cutting what bound them. She reached into her coat, pulled the shears she'd hidden since the loom first moved. Old, iron, heavy. Her hands shook, not from fear, but from knowing. She opened her sleeve, exposed the black strands growing from her forearm, and cut. Pain bloomed like lightning, warm, real. Black hair spilled from the wound, writhing, screaming, like worms fleeing light. She didn't stop. She cut again and again until her arm was clean, until the hair stopped fighting. And in the fire, the woman began to fall apart, peacefully, one tread at a time, becoming ash, becoming still. When it was over, Mira collapsed beside the fire, skin slick with blood, hands trembling, but heart quieter. For the first time in weeks, the world didn't hum, the trees didn't whisper, the mirror didn't move. She thought it was over. Until she returned home and found the grief mantle still there, still breathing. But now, it looked like her. And across the cloth, woven in thousands of looping, writhing strands, was her name. Over.
and over. Mira, 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 Mira. Each letter made of her own hair. The name came to her in a dream, Soraya. It floated in the dark, spoken in a dozen whispers, some fearful, some reverent, some bitter. When Mira woke, her pillow was wet, not from tears, but from dew. And at the edge of her bed, a thread of hair led toward the door. She followed it, barefoot, silent, the village still asleep. The thread wound through alleyways, past shuttered homes, past wells that hadn't drawn water in years. It led her to the oldest grave, one that bore no name, no stone, only a tree, twisted, split at the center like a wound that never healed. The thread disappeared into the roots, and she remembered the old woman's words, "Burn it where she died." But fire hadn't worked, because Soraya never burned. They'd tried long ago, when her husband died suddenly and she refused to grieve. She laughed at his funeral, wore red instead of black, let down her hair. And when the women came to offer her the mourning thread, she spit on it. They called her cursed, mad, possessed. So they bound her, cut her hair, buried her beneath the tree, alive, to teach the others. But Soraya had been clever. As they lowered her into the dirt, she whispered something, a vow, a spell, a curse. No one remembered the words, only the silence that followed, because her hair kept growing. Through the soil, through the roots, through the village until it reached the looms. The first widow who sat to weave found a strand already waiting. She didn't question it. She just began. And from that day forward, every widow received her portion, not of grief, but of Soraya, not of memory, but of vengeance. Mira fell to her knees, pressed her ear to the earth, and she heard it. Not screams, not whispers, laughter. Low, coarse, endless. A laughter that had never stopped, only changed its voice. And then a hand from beneath the soil brushed her ankle. Thin, clawed, thread-wrapped. She leapt back, heart hammering. The ground shifted, the roots groaned, and for a brief second, the tree wept. Not sap, not rain, but hair. Long, wet, black. It clung to her fingers, slithered around her wrist, and as she tore it away, she heard a voice not her own. "You stopped weaving, Mira. Now you must finish what she began." The wind that night was wrong. It didn't howl, it hissed, like thread being pulled through tight fabric. Too fast, too deep. Mira couldn't sleep, not with the laughter still echoing in her bones, not after Soraya's hand touched her skin. She lit a candle, let it bleed down her fingers, and walked. The village was dark, but not empty. Shadows moved between houses. Some limped, some crawled. She followed them. Through the back alleys, past the weaver's hut, toward the field beyond the shrine. There, beneath the hill of stones, where wild grass grew in circles, stood 7 women, all cloaked, all still. Each stood before a wooden stake,
worn smooth with time, splintered at the base, bound with thread. And before each stake, a mouth, not carved, not drawn, but stitched into the air. Mira blinked, and the mouths moved, not speaking, but straining, tugging at their stitches, as if something inside them still wanted to scream. One of the cloaked women stepped aside, revealing what stood behind her stake. A body, mummified, frozen mid-kneel, hands bound in front, mouth sewn shut with black thread, lips stretched to breaking, eyes missing. The stitches had grown into the skin like roots into soil. It had once been a widow. Now it was a warning. Mira turned away, gagged, but another woman pulled her closer, lowered her hood, and Mira gasped. It was the midwife, the one who had once spoken to her, the one with the voice like torn paper. But now her mouth was stitched at the corners, thread pulling tight with every breath, barely allowing a whisper. Still she spoke. "We tried." Her fingers trembled as she pointed at the others. One by one, they lowered their hoods. Faces once familiar, now disfigured. Lips mangled, chins sealed shut, tongues blackened from rot. They knew too much. The midwife held out a needle. Its tip glinted red, but not from blood, from thread that pulsed, alive. "You must choose," she rasped. "Weave or be woven." Behind her, the wind picked up, and she felt it, the grief mantle dragging itself toward her across the field, its edges flapping like breathless lungs, its mouth, the new mouth, open, wider, wider, thread spilling out like tongues. She ran, but not home, to the only place she hadn't dared return. The loom. The floor creaked differently that night, not from wood, but from what pulsed beneath it. Mira felt it the moment she stepped into the room, a softness where the ground used to be firm, like walking on skin just under the surface. The loom was silent, but the grief mantle had moved. It now stretched along the floor, curling gently, pointing toward the wall, toward the place where her husband had once carved their names, now faded, now rotted. She got down on her knees, pressed her ear to the boards, and heard it. A heartbeat, but not hers, not human. Slow, heavy, thick with earth and memory. She stood, grabbed a knife, and began to pry at the floor. The first plank came free easily, as if it wanted to be lifted. The second snapped, releasing a gust of damp air that smelled of ash and decay. She dug, bare hands tearing through the dirt, nails cracking, breath shallow. In the dim light, she saw the first one, a braid, still intact, half buried, threaded through roots like ivy. She kept digging. More hair surfaced, then more, until it was clear. The entire foundation of her house was sitting atop a bed of tangled hair. Some strands were old, gray, dust-dry. Others were fresh, still damp, still growing. She pulled at one. It resisted, then tightened. Not like rope, but like muscle. It pulled back, and the soil beneath her hand moved, shifted, opened. She screamed as a face emerged, not fully formed, eyes sealed shut, mouth twisted open in an eternal scream, hair blooming from its scalp like a crown of roots. Then another, and another, dozens, hundreds, all beneath her home, sleeping, breathing, bound.
the threads from their heads twisted together, braided into the very walls of the village, feeding the looms, feeding the cloth, feeding her. She fell backward, clawed away from the hole, gagging on the smell of iron and rot. Behind her, the grief mantle began to rise, not float, rise, as if lifted by invisible hands, as if greeting its kin. And in the stillness, from the soil came a voice. "We're still here, Mira. We never left. You just forgot to look beneath your feet." It was waiting for her when she returned. The mirror, still hanging on the bedroom wall, still framed in black wood, still untouched, but different. The glass had grown darker, almost liquid, as if the surface no longer reflected light, but drank it. Mira approached slowly, candle in hand, blood still crusted beneath her fingernails. She expected to see herself, tired, broken, covered in ash. But what she saw was the past. Her wedding day, sunlight catching in her hair, her husband smiling, before grief had entered their home. Then the image rippled and shifted. The night she first met Eli, the way her hand lingered on his, the way her lips parted before the kiss, the way she didn't look back. Her reflection was not mimicking her, it was remembering for her, accusing her. She tried to look away, but her eyes wouldn't move. The mirror held her. Scene after scene, memory after memory, each one a thread tugged from her mind, stitched into the glass. And then it changed again. Now there were faces, not hers, not his. The widow's, the midwife, the old woman from the hall, and they were all watching her through the glass, their eyes full of things unsaid, of things suffered. Behind them, a shape, growing larger with each breath, shadowed, mouth sewn shut, hands made of woven thread. It stepped forward, and when it touched the inside of the glass, Mira felt her own skin burn. The mirror cracked, not outward, but inward, sucking the air around it, becoming a mouth, and it spoke, not in sound, but in image. Her husband's body twisting, reaching, burning, crawling from the fire she had lit, and then Eli, eyes hollow, throat unspooled, his tongue replaced with thread. Then Mira herself, but not as she was now, as she would be, mouth sealed, eyes blank, sitting at the loom forever. She stepped back, clutching her chest. "Stop!" she whispered. But the mirror did not stop, because the mirror had always belonged to the loom, to the thread, to Soraya. Suddenly, the room went still. The glass turned black, then clear again, and Mira's reflection looked back at her, smiling. But Mira wasn't smiling. Her reflection reached up, grasped at her own throat, and began to pull thread from her mouth, one strand, then another, then a whole spool, still smiling, still unraveling, until her jaw snapped wide, too wide, and a voice echoed from within. "The cloth remembers every lie, and you are stitched with more than most." The glass shattered, but Mira was already gone. The mirror was gone, shattered into nothing. Not even shards remained, only dust, fine, black, bitter on the tongue. Mira lay on the floor,
chest rising slowly, mouth dry, eyes unfocused. But she was breathing, and that was the mistake, because something else was breathing too, through her. She sat up, joints cracking, skin sore, limbs heavy. Her fingers ached, but not from exhaustion, from growth. She looked at her hands and screamed. Her veins had darkened, thread-thin lines of black, pulsing beneath her skin, moving beneath the surface as if alive. She reached to her chest, felt the rise of her ribs, and beneath them a twitch, a loom. Not wood, not metal, but something growing from her spine, her bones shifting, becoming rails, her hands curling inward, thumbs pressed back, forming the frame. She fell to her knees, fingers seizing, muscles twisting into unnatural shapes. From her mouth came thread, smooth, black, unending. It poured from her like breath, like confession, like punishment. Across the room, the grief mantle lifted. It dragged itself forward, crawling, hungry, joyful. It reached her feet and climbed, up her legs, over her chest, around her neck, and it whispered in every voice she'd ever known, "Welcome, Mira. Now you will never stop. Now you will never leave." Her body obeyed. She rose, not of her own will, but of the threads. Her arms locked into place, her fingers flexed, ready to weave. The shuttle floated to her hand as if magnetized by fate. The first strand passed through, then the second, then the third. Her breath synced with the rhythm, weft, pull, tighten, repeat. Outside, the forest bowed. The widows watched from shadow, eyes lowered, mouths sealed. The mantle began to grow again, stronger, smoother, wet with memory. And in every fiber was her name, her blood, her failure. She was no longer Mira. She was the loom. She was the vessel. She was the punishment. And somewhere, deep in the cloth, a new face formed. Not yet dead, not yet chosen, but soon, very soon, because the village was never short of grief, only waiting for another love, another betrayal, another woman to take her place and begin again. The days blurred. Or maybe they stopped. It was hard to tell when you no longer slept, when your hands no longer rested, when every breath came only in rhythm with the shuttle. Weft, pull, tighten, repeat. The loom no longer stood in the room. She was the loom, and she wove through pain, through blood, through dreams. At first she tried to scream, tried to cry out for help, for Eli, for her husband, even for Soraya. But nothing came, no sound, no voice, only hair, long, black, sliding from between her lips, tugging itself down her throat as if stitching her from the inside. She clawed at her mouth, tore at her cheeks, but the threads wove faster than she could tear, until there was no mouth left, only a seam, tight and smooth, a smile made from silence. And the grief mantle grew faster, taller, wider,
hungrier. It began to spill words. At first, just names: Eli, Mira, Soraya. Then phrases: I didn't want to marry him. I wanted to leave. I wanted Eli to take me away. Mira froze. She hadn't said those things. Not aloud, not even to herself. But they were true, and the cloth knew. It kept going. I stopped weaving the night he died. I lied to the elders. I kissed Eli before the body was cold. The words bled out onto the shroud, letter by letter, woven in thread that shimmered red. Not ink, blood. Her blood. And still, her fingers moved. She tried to stop, to break her own hands, to bite through the cords, but she had no mouth, only thread. The grief mantle wrapped tighter around her body, each pass locking her further in, each line of truth strangling denial, until even her memories began to unravel. She forgot the sound of her own voice, forgot the color of her husband's eyes, forgot Eli's laugh, forgot who Mira had been. But the cloth remembered. The cloth always remembered. And at night, when the wind pushed against the shutters and the villagers walked faster past her home, they heard it. Not her voice, but the shrouds, whispering truths no one dared speak. And behind every window, behind every stitched mouth, the other widows wept, not because they were free, but because they knew she had taken their place. And now she would never stop weaving, not until the next one came, not until the loom found a new mouth to silence.
They came for her at dusk. 6 widows, veiled, silent, each holding a candle that didn't flicker. Mira didn't resist. She couldn't. Her feet moved, not by choice, but by pull, as if the loom had woven a path into her bones, as if her veins now obeyed a different rhythm. They led her beyond the last house, past the field of quiet looms, past the graves without names, to the house without thread. She'd heard of it. Whispers passed between breaths, a place no widow spoke of, because it didn't belong to grief. It belonged to control. The door opened without a touch, wood groaning like ribs cracking. Inside, a single room, empty, except for a chair. Not a loom, not a shrine, just a chair. And in it sat her, the oldest widow. But not withered, not frail, ageless, skin like porcelain dipped in ink, hair white but untouched by time, eyes so dark they swallowed candlelight. She wore no veil, no shroud, only a dress the color of dried blood. She smiled, and the room dimmed. "Sit," she said, voice like silk soaked in smoke. Mira obeyed, because her body no longer belonged to her. "You've done well," the woman said. "Weaving truth into thread is no small task." Mira tried to speak, but the seam across her mouth held fast. The woman waved her hand, and Mira's mouth opened. Not healed, not hers, but unstitched just enough to scream.
And scream she did, but the sound came out wrong. Not like pain, but like prayer. "Why?" she gasped. "Why me?" The woman leaned forward. "You loved someone after death. You broke the rhythm. You reminded the thread that it can fray." Mira's hands shook, but they still mimed the weaving motion. She couldn't stop. "Who are you?" she whispered. The woman smiled wider. "I am the one who listened when Soraya cursed. I am the one who fed the first braid to the roots. I am the reason the cloth remembers." Mira's voice cracked. "You don't weave." "No," the woman said, "because I remember. And memory, child, is more powerful than mourning." She rose. Her shadow stretched across the walls, bending like a loom warping in fire. She touched Mira's forehead, and Mira saw every widow who had ever lived, stitched into time, eyes blank, hands bleeding, mouths sealed, hearts still beating. "You are not the first," the woman said, "and you will not be the last." She leaned in. "So keep weaving, and when the next one arrives, teach her silence." The room faded, the candles blew out, and Mira awoke at her loom, thread in hand, blood on her lap. The grief mantle now reaching the ceiling, still hungry, still unfinished. And from the walls, the whispers began again. "We are remembered because you will never let us go." It started with a crack, a quiet one from the wood beneath her loom, like something finally snapping after holding too long. Mira looked down. The grain had split just slightly, but enough. And for the first time in days, she felt something that wasn't despair. She felt resistance. She stood up, fingers trembling, blood crusted in the lines of her palms. The grief mantle loomed high above her now, filling half the room, a curtain of sorrow too thick to see through, too heavy to carry. But Mira had enough. She pulled it down, ripped it from the loom, strand by strand, tearing out faces, memories, names. It screamed, not aloud, but through her bones, the kind of scream that breaks ribs from the inside. She dragged the cloth outside, through the village. The widows turned as she passed, but none moved, none spoke, as if they were statues, or graves, or willing shadows. She reached the shrine, piled the cloth at its base, and lit the torch. The flames hesitated again, always reluctant to touch the truth, but she forced it, and it burned. The grief mantle, the loom, the braid, the thread, all of it. For the first time in what felt like 100 lifetimes, the smoke was white. She collapsed, fell to her knees, face lifted to the sky. She waited for something, for peace, for silence, for a voice to say, "You're free." But instead, there was laughter. Behind her, soft at first, then growing. She turned. The widows were smiling, not kindly, not cruelly, but knowingly. One stepped forward, the midwife, her lips stitched tight, but her eyes wide open. She raised her hand, pointed toward the ashes, and from them, something
moved. Not thread, not cloth, but root. Hair, growing, regrowing, feeding on the burn, feeding on the act of resistance. Mira backed away. "No," she whispered, "I ended it." The oldest widow appeared behind the others, her voice like silk tearing. "No, child, you fed it. Do you not understand? We do not weave because we are forced. We weave because we belong." And then Mira saw it, the truth, in the widow's eyes, in their calmness, their unity. They didn't want freedom. They wanted to remain, bound, defined by the weight of grief. Because in grief there was power, there was identity, there was order. Mira fell to the ground, fingers dug into the soil, desperate, shaking. The hair beneath the earth coiled around her wrists, climbed her arms, pulled her close, and in her mind a whisper returned. "You tried to burn the thread, but the fire remembers your hands." The village was quiet again, as if nothing had happened, as if fire had not touched grief, as if screams had never filled the walls. Mira was gone. No one spoke her name. No one asked where she'd gone, because they didn't have to. The loom in her home stood whole again, untouched, waiting, and beside it a new spool of thread, fresh, black, still warm. In another house, across the square, a girl awoke to silence. Her husband had died in the night. Illness, sudden, unfair. She was young, too young, skin still soft from laughter, eyes not yet hollow from loss. The widows came for her at dawn, veiled, candle-lit, silent. They placed a bundle in her hands, wrapped in maroon. She opened it and frowned. "Hair?" she whispered. The oldest widow smiled gently. "We all begin this way." The girl looked down, touched the thread. It twitched beneath her fingers. Something about it felt familiar, but she didn't know why. She was taken to Mira's house, but she didn't know the name, didn't ask why the walls seemed to sigh. The loom stood ready, thread already guided through the shuttle, the first row already begun. She touched it, and it felt warm. She sat, confused, heart heavy, and wove her first line. Behind her, the shadows thickened. The candle flickered, and from the grief mantle, still hanging on the far wall, a face began to form, one thread at a time, one stitch at a breath. Lips sealed, eyes soft. It was Mira, not as she had died, but as she had remained. And as the girl wove, Mira watched, not with sorrow, not with rage, but with understanding. The loom moved, the thread sang, the past tightened its grip. And the girl, she began to hum a song she didn't know. Something about longing, something about fire, something about never stopping. Weft, pull, tighten, repeat. Outside, the forest leaned in. The wind carried no warning, only a whisper. Another begins, another belongs. The room had been cleaned. No blood, no broken glass, no threads on the floor, only silence. The new widow sat at the loom, her hands unsure, her breath shallow, but she moved with the rhythm, weft, pull, tighten, repeat. She hadn't cried yet, not fully. The pain hadn't reached her lungs. She just wanted to do what was asked, to be respectful, to be strong, to be what the village expected. Outside the window, the sky held the color of wet ash, not yet night, but too tired to be day. A single candle burned in the far corner, its light dancing against the wooden frame of an old mirror. She hadn't noticed it before, hadn't dared to look into it. But tonight, her eyes wandered, drawn by something she couldn't name. She stood, walked toward it, thread still clinging to her sleeves, and stared. At first, she saw herself, a little older than she remembered, a little paler. Then, the image shifted, only slightly. Her reflection tilted its head. She did not. It blinked. She did not. Its lips parted. Hers remained closed, and it smiled, soft, sad, final. It was Mira, not whole, not broken, just there, like she'd always been. Her lips were sealed with the thinnest black thread, so thin it looked like shadow, so tight it looked like purpose. And behind her, 100 other faces, layered into the glass, stitched into the silver, watching, not angry, not mourning, only waiting. The girl stepped back, covered the mirror with the nearest cloth, but the reflection stayed. She turned away, returned to the loom, and as she picked up the shuttle, she whispered to herself, words she didn't remember learning. I will be strong. I will be silent. I will belong. The loom creaked, the thread sighed, and the house swallowed the sound. Outside, the village slept. And in the mirror, now uncovered once more, Mira kept smiling, because the thread never ends, only the names change.